Esperando um pouquinho para dar a sessão. Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. Damos início aqui a mais uma das atividades e conferências do primeiro Simpósio Internacional de Cinema e Análise Fílmica. Eu sou Fábio Shoa, docente do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação da Anhembi Morumbi e membro da comissão organizadora desse evento. A atividade agora, ela deve durar em torno de 1h30. Ela vai ser uma exposição da professora, pesquisadora, curadora, Kaira Cabañas, em torno do cinema letrista, e que vai ser seguida por um diálogo nosso e questões colocadas pelo público interessado. Kaira Cabañas é professora de História da Arte Moderna e Contemporânea na Universidade da Flórida. Kaira é bacharel em estudos comparados, com ênfase à América Latina e ao leste europeu, pela Duke University. É também mestre e doutora em História da Arte, respectivamente pela Yale University e pela Princeton University. Kaira possui extensa bibliografia entre livros e artigos dedicados à sua especialidade, que é a arte moderna contemporânea, entre Américas, Europa e também o Brasil. Sua atuação abrange debates da intersecção entre diferentes disciplinas, incluindo história da arte, cinema, estudos da América Latina e, mais recentemente, os intercâmbios transatlânticos em arte e psiquiatria. Entre outros livros, é autora de The Myth of Nouveau Realism, Arte and Performative in Postwar France, de 2013, Off-Screen Cinema, Isidore Isou and the Lettrist Avant-Garde, de 2014, Learning from Madness, Brazilian Modernism and Global Contemporary Art, de 2018, e Immanent Vitalities, Matter and Meaning in Modern and Contemporary Art, de 2021. Em 2012, Kaira foi curadora e organizadora do catálogo da exposição Espectros de Artaud, a linguagem e a arte nos anos 50, no Museu Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofia, em Madrid. A gente vê que tem uma extensa produção, Kaira, e chegamos então a um pouco aquilo que vamos conversar hoje. Dentro do trajeto de Kaira, a pesquisa sobre o cinema letrista é um ponto bastante particular. Entre a historiografia existente, Off-Screen Cinema é um dos poucos livros dedicados ao cinema desse grupo artístico, redigido com base em acurada pesquisa em arquivos e análise de imagens. O livro Off-Screen Cinema dialoga, em particular, com algumas das frentes de trabalho abrangidas pela pesquisa de Kaira. Por um lado, faz parte do contexto histórico-artístico da França do pós-guerra, explorado no livro The Myth of Nouveau Realism. Por outro lado, guarda sugestivos diálogos com a violência e a agressão próprios às propostas de Antoine Artaud, artista também abordado em trabalhos teóricos e de curadoria de Kaira Cabañas. Kaira, é com grande satisfação, né, que nós vamos escutá-la e dialogar com você aqui hoje. Teremos, então, uma exposição sua em inglês, né, seguido por diálogos, também em português, em inglês. É um grande prazer tê-la, Kaira. A fala está com você. Obrigado.
Thank you, Fabio, for that introduction. I'm going to say just a few things in Portuguese, and then I will continue. Eu queria agradecer o Fábio e todo o comitê do Congresso pelo convite para falar com vocês hoje. E como eu tenho feito essa pesquisa em francês e inglês, e tenho escrito sobre o cinema, letrista em inglês, eu decidi dar a fala em inglês, mas então eu queria também expressar minha gratidão a vocês por acompanhar essa fala em inglês. E se no final alguém tiver uma pergunta em espanhol ou português, pode colocar e eu respondo. Então, okay, so now I'm going to go back to English and say again, thank you to Fabio for this wonderful invitation to speak in the context of the Simpósio Internacional de Cinema e Análise Fílmica, and especially for an audience in Brazil and abroad, but particularly Brazil, since so much of my current research takes place there. And in terms of the subject of today's talk, Off-Screen Cinema, which was my second book, I have to say that its origin bespeaks a certain contretemps. So when I began the research for my first book, the first book I read was Frédéric Devaux's The Lettrist Cinema. And so before even beginning to research Nouveau Réalisme, I was reading about lettrism, but then kind of decided I needed to wait for another moment to go down the path of lettrist research. You know, at the time that I read that book, I had never heard of Isidore Isou. I had never heard of lettrism. And as Fabio just mentioned, it's really a movement that has not been so accounted for in dominant histories of post-war art and film. And so Off-Screen Cinema itself was published about 7 years ago, I guess, so January 2015. And in terms, I'm going to share my screen now. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will present. So I wanted to just show the first moment that I spoke about lettrist cinema in the Brazilian context was actually at the Universidade de Verão, which was organized by Capacete in 2012. And this is our reconstruction of Gilles Volman's anti-concept, which I'm happy to speak more about later. But so this is more to say that I've spoken about this material in a very different context, but at the time that I presented at the Universidade de Verão, I was still in the writing process of the book. Let me see. This is the book cover with the table of contents. And in terms of the actual book structure, I speak about 5 films that were made in the years 1951 to 52. So the works of Isidore Isou, Maurice Lemaitre, Gilles Volman, François Dufresne, and Guy Debord. And a central concern of lettrist films is the disjunction between what one sees and how one hears in a cinematic context. The book, however, is not a comprehensive account of lettrist film. Instead, I focus on these inaugural years of their experiments in cinema and the particular dialectic of what goes on and off the screen. From the get-go, my ambition was to write a short history that would serve as an invitation for other scholars to continue work on the subject. And so before I begin my talk proper, I have these various preludes to the actual talk. I wanted to take you a bit through an archival tour to give you a glimpse of some of the archives I visited. So this was Isidore Isou's archive before it was acquired by the Bibliothèque Kandinsky at the Pompidou. This was in his apartment that he lived in, and his daughter, Catherine Goldstein, was who helped me kind of go through some of those papers and boxes. And in those boxes, I found letters from Stan Brakhage to Isidore Isou. And so this for me was a little bit of a triumph of an archival find, even though I don't really deal with Brakhage in my book. By the time I began work on Maurice Lemaitre's film, his archive had already been acquired by the Beinecke at Yale. And in that context, I found this wonderful clipping that you see on the right, where he talks about where the use of professional spectators is addressed. Sorry, there we go. So Charlotte Volman, Gilles Volman's widow, let me into her home to visit and consult her papers in relation to Volman. And that was at the moment before they went to the Beinecke. And in that context, I found a letter that Wollman had written to Keith Sanborn, who had organized a screening of L'Anticoncept at Exit Art in 1990. And so in that letter to Keith Sanborn, Wollman asks him to film the audience watching L'Anticoncept. And so you see the film of the audience watching L'Anticoncept, an image of that on the far right of the slide. So my slides are advancing somewhat with a little bit of décalage, my apologies. And so then in terms of Debord, I was, provoked by this situation of lettrism very rarely being accounted for in the situationist literature, and then found this early photograph of Debord with Isou written on the wall, and also these martini napkins in his archive, which describe some of the scenes of Isou's first film. And so all of that just to say these, these little archival moments that then, lead to the book itself. And one thing before I move forward, there's no existing photography of those original Lettrist screenings. So when I show an image of a public watching the film, it's usually a reconstruction or something that was done much later. So I don't want to naturalize that, but just so that you're aware that they're images that are used in some sense as prompt for a memory of an absent document that doesn't exist to document the original, right? So, okay, so I'm going to begin. A sound film without images. When someone speaks, the screen is white and filled with light, and when no one speaks, the screen remains dark. Of the total running time of 75 minutes, only 20 minutes contain light and speech. The film is none other than Guy Debord's Hurlements en faveur de Sade, but on this particular day, Sunday, March 1st, 2009, I imagined that the grandeur of the Lincoln Center Walter Reed's Theater is decidedly at odds with the ambiance of the Parisian Film Club in which the film was originally shown in June 1952. At the Walter Reed, during one of Hurlement's black sequences, a member of the audience, frustrated, I gather, by the acoustic disturbances interrupting his aesthetic contemplation of the dark screen, told two gentlemen sitting in front of me to shut up. Needless to say, such an act of censure was not welcomed by the remaining public, who quickly began launching questions along the lines of, and I quote, "Do you really think an attitude of referential silence is the best way to approach this film?" End quote. At some point, someone mobilized the admittedly scant public to engage in song. They sang everything from the International to Born in the USA. Given these events, one reviewer queried, and I quote, "Why replay a role that an audience had already played 50 years earlier?" Yet in 2009, the screening of Hurlements at the Walter Reed revealed that what was at stake for the public was precisely the active reception the film inevitably provokes. And as you can see in this clipping here, the public felt they needed to do something. And I've highlighted, this is one of the reviews of that very contentious screening. There's no doubt that Debord conceived Hurlements and its possible effects in the wake of the various Lettrist films he attended in the years 1951 to 1952. Lettrism, a movement founded by Isidore Isou in 1946, pursued experimentation in various fields, from the novel to theater, from painting to cinema. There is, as it were, no shortage of ink spilled on Debord and his films. But at the time that I was researching the myth of Nouveau Réalisme, few analyses took into account the Lettrist cinematic experimentation from which Debord's later work emerged. In what follows, I examined the films of Isidore Isou and Maurice Lemaitre in relation to the question of audience and film reception that the anecdote from the Walter Reed clearly sets in relief. At issue is the Lettrist attempt to transform the practices that came to define cinema at the time. The late 1940s and early 50s, a time of intense post-war reconstruction and political instability in France, witnessed the opening of the Cannes Film Festival, the establishment of the Cinémathèque Française's first screening room in 1947, and the concurrent appreciation of Hollywood cinema. An American in Paris won Best Picture in 1952. In the margins of this context, Lettrist film posed a challenge to industrial cinema's conventions, so continuity editing, sync sound, the use of a screen, as well as the necessity of its image support, the film strip, in order to generate new conditions and communities of viewing. So for example, Isou uncoupled the unity of image and sound in what he called montage discrépant. And at the beginning of the film, you see this note to the spectator that says you're about to see a discrepant film. No reimbursement for your ticket is allowed if you choose to leave the screening. Gilles Volman used a weather balloon instead of a flat image screen in the production of L'Anticoncept. And François Dufresne totally abandoned the film strip to produce a film exclusively performed with live speech and sound. And so I'm just showing you here the soundtrack, which was performed live to the film. In this presentation, I turn to Isou's and Lemaitre's recourse to and resurrection of the Interwar Film Club, a social and at times political forum for the presentation and discussion of film. For the Lettrists, the film clubs not only provided an actual site for their film's screenings, but crucially, the social form of verbal communication that the film club engendered came to define both the content and structure of Isou's and Lemaitre's first films. On April 20th, 1951, Isou presented his Traité de Babi d'éternité, parallel to the Cannes Film Festival. With this work, Isou employed montage discrépant and also drew directly on the celluloid, a procedure intended to exacerbate and produce what he called l'image ciselante, or the sizzled image. Isou affirmed, and I quote, "I am certain that Traité de Babi d'éternité will change cinema drastically and push it towards unexpected paths. It requires only that juries lend it an attentive ear." In the wake of sound synchronization, the status of the listening subject became a central concern of Lettrist films, with Isou's emphasis on oral perception as a way to counter the primacy of the photographic image. We find echoes, as I have elsewhere argued, of Antonin Artaud. At issue for Artaud was not the advent of the soundtrack per se, but rather that sound would be circumscribed to reproducing only speech coming from a face on the screen. So Isou's traité, and I encourage you all to see it, develops in three parts. In part one, Isou includes shots of himself, so he's in the center image here, and his Lettrist cohort walking around Saint-Germain-des-Prés. In part two, he includes miscellaneous footage, and I think that my slide advanced too much. He includes miscellaneous footage, as in his encounter with a woman sea fishing, as well as found footage from the French Indo-Chinese War that he called from the trash bins of the cinema services sections of the Armed Forces Ministry. In part three, he features prominent lettrists such as François Dufresne on the left. You have the absence of images as when he paints on this film strip itself, as you see in the middle. And then on the far right, you have also cameos by avant-garde figures like Jean Cocteau. The film, as previously evoked, is characterized by what Isou termed montage discrépant, or the purposeful non-synchronization between image and sound. And so what's interesting for me here is that in the sequence from part one, alongside the images that you see, the soundtrack also represents a film club debate in which Daniel, the soundtrack protagonist, explains what his film will be. All the while, we hear the rhythm of a Lettrist chorus in the acoustic background. Daniel affirms his proposal for a new cinema as best he can over the audience's hisses and boos, and ultimately he queries, and I quote, "Whoever said that cinema, whose meaning is movement, must be absolutely the movement of the photograph and not the movement of speech," end quote. The format of the film club debate is also featured in the film's opening shots. So on the far left and in the center, we see Isou leaving a film club on the Rue d'Anton, as well as a flyer announcing a Chaplin film, as well as the screening debate. And so I don't know if my cursor translates to YouTube, but you can see here that there's the announcement of the débat après les séances. And at 25 minutes in the soundtrack, you hear this declaration: I hereby announce the manifesto of discrepant cinema. So you don't see that written as it's written here. This is just the English subtitle, but this is announced and then, is a kind of proclamation for part 2. And in part 2, you see the formal experimentation with the chiseling of the image through the manipulation of the celluloid by writing on the image, shots suggesting 180-degree camera rotation and the painted film strip. And while there's certainly more that can be said about Isou's interventions on the celluloid and the peculiar formal quality they evoke through the shimmering flatness of the marks and the illusory depth of the cinematic image, given the emphasis of this presentation, I'll again call attention to Isou's specific choice to reproduce a film club debate on the soundtrack. For when complete, the film's soundtrack allows Isou to explain his work in the same amount of time that it takes to screen the film. Isou's reproduction of a film club debate foregrounds films constitutive outside, that is, the alternate cinema network whose origins in the 1920s provided a context for avant-garde film and first strove to define and uphold film as an art. The first actual film club in France was the Club des Amis du 7e Art, or CASA, which included among its ranks many members of the avant-garde. At their head was Ricotti Canudo. Now, the purpose of the film club movement in France was to encourage an informed audience, just as it was to seek official recognition of cinema as an art. Among their most singular characteristics, film clubs existed outside of the official commercial network, and they were also able to screen films that were otherwise banned for commercial distribution. Film clubs' activities were tolerated insofar as French authorities perceived them as fashioning an aesthetic elite and not as competition to the mass market in either aesthetic or political terms. Even so, during German occupation, film clubs were for the most part forbidden. So film clubs, because of their potentially politicizing agency under German occupation, you had maybe Henri Langlois and also André Bazin, who at times would hold sessions. So what Isou's film mobilizes as part of the soundtrack to his film are the live elements that form the film club's social organization, namely the tripartite format of short introductory lecture, screening, and post-screening debate, first codified in the 1920s. Thus, for the Lettrist, the film clubs did more than provide an actual venue for their screenings. With Traité, Isou inscribed a debate about the very film one attended within the materials of his film, while also provoking live debate at each of its screenings. Indeed, among Daniel's lines in the film, he states, and Daniel is the soundtrack protagonist, and I quote him, "One prefers reflection of debates on cinema in the cinema to ordinary cinema as such." So having worked as an assistant on Isou's film, Maurice Lemaitre soon turned to his own film work with the production of Le Film est déjà commencé. With this work, Lemaitre further explored the possibilities of montage discrépant, the chiseling of the filmed image, as well as the destruction of the conventional screen. And I really love this poster on the right with these axes kind of like tearing away at the screen. In his film, some marks are abstract and others visibly iconic. Letters, words, numbers, and other kinds of symbols appear on abstract backgrounds, as well as over filmed images. Lemaitre also hand-colored the film. The film includes abstract, alternating black and white sequences that produce mild stroboscopic effects, and frames of pure color also interrupt the film's movement. A few sequences present Hollywood logos as well as commercial advertising, while the film repeatedly calls attention to itself through intertitles such as Un film pas comme les autres. I have a question if you all are seeing this. Subtitles aren't currently available. Can I see a yes? I don't know why that is happening. Okay, I think it went away. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we have all of these frames that call attention to themselves, like this one, which says un film pas comme les autres. So a film that calls attention to itself, declaring that it's a film like no other. And as with Traité, there's much more that could be said about the formal experimentation within the film itself, from the disjuncture between image and sound to the formal panoply of images and their attendant manipulations. But what is significant here is that Lemaitre designated his film as a séance du cinéma, a kind of film performance, which moved Lettrist film beyond the image and soundtracks and toward experimentation with the spaces of the screen and of projection, that is, what goes on and off the screen. And I'm showing you these two images just to give you a sense of how the image on the right is a later film that was reproduced at the Pompidou in 1955, but you see how the individuals in the film are holding up, to me, I imagine them as like little frames of film, but they're like these white posters, right, that they use to actually interrupt the projection beam. And so you have all of these things that are multiplied in Le Film est déjà commencé, but then also continue within Lettrist film practice. And so with that, I'm going to show you the script to the film. So in the published script to the film, in addition to the columns designating the image and the soundtrack, you also have a column with the heading salle, which you see on the far right, or theater, thereby drawing attention to the environmental and more specifically spectatorial situation. Here, Lemaitre outlines how his film begins. So I'm going to read you that right-hand column where it says salle. He writes, a rose-colored portable screen will be installed at the entrance to the cinema. An hour before the screening, an impassive operator will project on it cinema classics, for example, Intolerance by Griffith. On the sidewalk in front of the theater will be written in enormous yogurt white letters the words, here at 8:30 p.m., cinema seance, with an arrow pointing to the register. He then continues by describing that even though the film was announced for 8:30, the audience would wait for an hour during which individuals on the building's floor would beat dusty rugs and throw buckets of ice on the people waiting in line below in order to provoke an exchange of insults. Once inside the theater, the audience would see that the screen is not the customary flat rectangle, but is transformed by colored pieces of drapery placed on it and moving objects suspended in front of it. While spectators find their seats, the concluding minutes of a Western would be shown. When it ends, the spectators would then be asked to evacuate the theater and it would be cleaned. Eventually, back in the theater, the film director would begin a defense of his film, which should be interrupted by booing from the crowd. So this, salle column is basically legislating what the spectators should do, as well as including, various actions that should be followed. So insofar as these events are surely staged as a form of avant-garde provocation, Lemaitre here stages the scandal of the film before any scandal actually occurs. What is more, these actions described in the salle column are subsequently reproduced in the film's soundtrack, so that at approximately 19 minutes into the film, you hear on the soundtrack the very events that I just narrated as part of the column with the heading salle. As the soundtrack and image track unfold, the film further refuses the directional force of narrative film through the repeated references, both visual and verbal, to the film's beginning, its end, as well as future installments through statements such as prochainement sur cet écran. So before considering other aspects of Lemaitre's film, I'd like to draw attention to his largely unremarked published proposal, Basis for the Education, the Cinematographic Education of the Public through Permanent Critique, which was published in 1952. And in this text, Lemaitre calls for a production company for chiseled films that will redirect the spectator's demand for narrative films. The company's employees would be required to go to a minimum of 3 screenings a day and to interrupt the screenings. Moreover, Lemaitre offers specific instructions for the use of these professional spectators who could carry out his challenge to commercial cinema. Lemaitre describes the language and frequency of interruptions, as well as the film genres to be disrupted. But what is peculiar about Lemaitre's proposed disturbances is the agency given to the voice of the professional spectator in the modulation of a film's meaning. So, for example, in the case of a crime thriller, he writes, and I'm going to read from this detail, he says, "In the case in which the identification of the criminal is obvious, do not miss any occasion to specify this as such through assessments of his person. He has a nasty face, that must be him, even if he is likable. This attitude will augment ordinary spectators' impressions of a déjà vu, given that they are already deceived by the perception of the character's guilt. On the other hand, if the criminal is difficult to identify, choose while waiting any person from the film, likable if possible, and accuse them systematically." So here, the professional spectator's speech denaturalizes the image's narrative meaning, on the one hand, through an exaggerated attention to physiognomic characteristics, and on the other hand, through an arbitrary designation, possibly at odds with the film's narrative conceit. What Lemaitre's proposal for the public's cinematographic education points to is how the recourse to live speech in relation to the image demonstrates language's performative force in cinema. Saying something equals doing something to the image's meaning. Lemaitre prefigures the interruptive strategies of professional spectators in various intertitles presented in the course of Le Film est déjà commencé. For example, about halfway into the film, you read, "You will discover the culprit," as you see in this frame enlargement. Subsequently, his prospective production company did receive a small write-up in the contemporary press, a brief newspaper column, the one I showed at the outset that I found in the archive, describes the potential use of salaried voyeurs. Yet what is most telling is the critic's designation of these cinema production workers as active contemplation professionals, thereby isolating how the production company's primary task was to target normative viewing practices understood as passive. So crucially at this time, and just 3 years after Lemaitre's film and his publication on the employment of professional spectators, André Bazin published the article, "How to Introduce and Debate a Film." As a key film critic at the time, Bazin's article emerges as a practical guide for leading film club debates. With regard to the presentation made prior to a film, Bazin recommends that it be short, given that people go to the cinema to watch films and not to listen to lectures. For the debate after the screening, Bazin affirms how the primary task is to leave the public with only an illusion of critical freedom, while providing a minimum of security against the perfectly superfluous digressions. He describes 2 principal methods for conducting a film club discussion, the liberal method and the authoritarian method. In the liberal method, the film presenter allows members of the public to speak. This method entails certain risks for Bazin, among them intellectual disorder and giving equal weight to interventions of differing quality. The authoritarian method, by contrast, entails a careful exposition of the film, isolating its important elements and thereby gaining clarity. Clarity is the term Bazin uses. Bazin confesses that he prefers the latter method, so he prefers the authoritarian method, but suggests striking a healthy balance between allowing viewers to say whatever they want, willy-nilly, and enforcing a strictly top-down model of communication. According to one post-war study from 1964, The purpose of the film club pedagogy was to draw the viewer out of the hypnotic sleep in which the film plunged him, to transform passivity into active attitude, end quote. Bazin in film club culture thus shared Lemaitre's desire to cultivate the public's active reception, or at least an active attitude. The differences in terms of how this was to be done reveal the discursive limitations regarding the conventional dichotomy between active and passive spectatorship. This is to say that Lemaitre championed actual participation, while the film clubs promoted the knowledge one might gain through contemplative modes of viewing. Consequently, Bazin upholds a dialectic between quasi-mythical silence during the screening and the resonance and aesthetic appreciation of the film through guided conversation. Yet whatever the aesthetic of a particular film, viewers were, in Bazin's view, to remain immobile and not to speak during the projection. Serge Denis later writes how the film audience had been, and I quote Denis, slowly trained to give up its bad habits, to quit talking or interrupting the projection with cries, end quote. Serge Denis continues, and I quote, what we call the history of cinema is the history of the public's domestication, its immobilization. Broadly speaking, immobile people who become sensitive to the mobility of the world, end quote. So apropos of bad habits, an intertitle in Le Film est déjà commencé rather cheekily calls attention to the emerging disciplinary regime. It states, spectators are reminded that smoking openly is prohibited. And I love that it says, but I don't know how you would smoke not openly since the smoke would give you away. But anyway, it's really funny. And just to imagine a time when smoking was allowed in cinemas and the materiality of that in terms of what it means for the projection is also quite interesting, but I digress. So it is against the grain of the film club's enforcement of silence and regulation of speech that Lettrist cinema and Lemaitre's theory of cinematographic education must be understood. Returning to Le Film est déjà commencé, its structure alternates the coincidence between soundtrack and action in the actual space of the theater with soundtrack and ambient silence. All the while, the formal experimentation of the chiseled images unfurl before the spectator. At approximately 25 minutes into the film literally begins again as the curtain opens and the soundtrack describes the irregularity of the new screen. The penultimate line of the soundtrack describes how the final reel of the film cannot be found, while film extras dressed as police enter the theater and blow their whistles. With Le Film est déjà commencé, film's outside folds into its inside. The space of cinematic reception becomes coterminous with the production of meaning, and the viewer is placed in the complicated position of trying to comprehend how live performance and speech impinge on the images and speech emanating from the screen. In this way, Lemaitre's film, which is constantly beginning again, both on and off the screen, constitutes one attempt to use this medium in the service of a critical reception. Lemaitre worked towards this end by enlisting live action and speech, while also proposing another means for the education and management of spectators in the cinema. In so doing, he imagined another way to conduct conduct through film, a film production company with its own rules, employees, and inspectors dedicated to the exercise of a pedagogical project premised on permanent critique. With his traité, Isou largely confined his experimentation to the disjuncture of sound-image relations within film. With Lemaitre, the critical import of montage discrépante was rerouted to take effect in the space between the voices and images of the film and the voices and action in and of the theater. So by way of conclusion, I'll kind of provide a little map here. I'd like to suggest that the legacy of Lettrist experimentation in post-war Europe should not be underestimated, notably Guy Debord, as I've already mentioned, but also François Dufresne and Yves Klein, as well as filmmakers Jean-Luc Godard and Marguerite Duras, would draw upon the legacy of Lettrist films in competing ways. Lemaitre, for one, has maintained a sustained polemic across decades, or he sustained a polemic across decades, accusing autorist filmmakers of plagiarism. And so you can see this in one of his publications here on the far right, with the title Marguerite Duras to have done with this crook and generalized plagiarist. And of course, the Lettrists believe everybody copied them, and they also believe they invented everything. So I should, for those who are unfamiliar with the Lettrists, just to put that out there as well. In this context, and I think as an art historian, it's worth invoking ever so briefly Marcel Brothaer's well-known founding of the Museum of Modern Art Department of Eagles, a 4-year project that he began in his studio in Brussels in 1968. As a fictive museum, Brothaer's museum nevertheless engaged in the discursive activities of a real museum. As the museum's director, he circulated official letters, organized inaugural speeches, exhibitions, as well as publicity campaigns. Crucial here is that the 7th installment of Brothaer's fictional museum was the cinema section, which exhibited editing equipment and props and also featured a film program, thereby placing cinema at the heart of his fictional museum and also at the heart of institutional critique. Echoing Danielle in the soundtrack to Isou's Traité, Brothaer maintains, "At the origin of my intentions was the idea of cinema that moves away from the notion of movement," end quote. With regard to his films, such as Les Cowboys, Les Renards of 1967, which features his poetry, inspired by La Fontaine's eponymous fable, Brothaer continues, and so I'll read the quote that you see on the slide. "On a special screen, in photographic canvas, the book becomes a film. The film becomes a painting, the screen. It is on an image which summarizes the film that all the film's images are projected. This is not a film." Through his exploration of how visual language or visible language affects visual meaning, as well as his development of a new screen that includes printed text, Brothaer challenges the voice in cinema as it is traditionally conceived, just as he uses one medium, writing, to critique and elaborate the parameters of another, film. Brothaer's use of cinema turns not only to the devices of early cinema, but also perhaps aspects of the Lettrist films he may have seen in the 1950s, projected as they were at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. So, to conclude, Lettrist work with film tests the medium through the chiseling of the image and attention to live sound and speech. Beyond their initial experiments with sound-image relations in film and with the space of the theater, the Lettrists insistently hope to fashion another modality for experiencing and administering cinema as an institution. That is, they imagined other ways in which cinema might conduct a public. From Lemaitre's call for a new production company to the designation of the film club debate as the exclusive material of film. Lettrism thus constitutes an important chapter in the history of post-war avant-garde film practices that challenge film as film and at once attempt to transform the institution of cinema. To understand Lettrism in this way is to understand both parts of its challenge as well as the wide-reaching effects of its legacy in the arts. Engaging Lettrism today also demands creatively imagining what might have it meant to be a spectator who, denied the comfortable passive viewership of spectacle, participated in a contentious and non-consensual discussion about developments in film, while experiencing competing images and sounds both on and off the screen. Indeed, the Lettrist's work also obliges one to conjure the specter of what could have happened had Lettrist experimentation in actuality led to the absence of film. Thank you.
Vamos lá. Obrigado, Kaira. Eu acho que tem que descompartilhar a tela. Só esperando um pouquinho. Kaira, obrigado, muito obrigado pela sua fala tão rica, com tantos materiais de pesquisa. Você nos traz todo um trajeto muito interessante, né, trazendo materiais de arquivo, trazendo os significados relacionados ao cinema letrista nas origens, as questões, inclusive Bazin, né, as relações com Bazin, essa importância, né, a situação do cineclube, a situação de assistir a um filme, né, também é outro traço muito importante dessa cinematografia, né? Eu gostaria de começar com uma primeira questão. Você falou amplamente da sua pesquisa, não só do livro, né? Mas gostaria de voltar ao livro, Off-Screen Cinema, e fazer uma pergunta sobre o trajeto de pesquisa e construção do livro. Você traz um amplo trajeto, e parece que ele é um ponto de chegada, né, de um longo trajeto aí de experiências, de relações de trabalho, né, e de pesquisa, né? Por um lado, né, eu fico pensando como foram as relações com outros artistas, letristas. Você trouxe aqui algumas, né, na sua fala, né? E, por exemplo, Maurice Lemaitre. Por outro lado, você fala também na introdução, né, do P. Adam Sidney, que leu o livro, ajudou com a revisão final, né? Eu gostaria de saber como que foi a recepção pelo Adam Sidney, né? Enfim, já coloquei duas questões, posso colocar uma terceira ainda, né? Enfim, esse livro tem um longo trajeto de instituições, e você trouxe aqui também essa relação com, né, o curso Universidade de Verão, né, o Summer University, no Rio de Janeiro, em 2012, né, onde você chegou a fazer uma remontagem do L'Anticoncept, do Jules Vauban. Será que você pode falar um pouco mais sobre isso? São três questões em uma, né, mas a experiência geral, recepção pelo Sidney e a remontagem do anticonceito do Vauban.
Thank you, Fabio, for the question. I might have to ask you to remind me of the three, but we'll begin with the first one in terms of like the relations and the initial research. I think before anything else, I have to thank Frédéric Acquaviva, who is an experimental musician and composer, and who has been my fellow traveler at various moments in researching lettrism. He's been particularly generous and wonderful. And, you know, he and I did the exhibition Spectres of Artaud together, which included lettrism as a very big part of it. So I just, want to get out some thanks in terms of those relations as well. Maurice Lemaitre was the only first generation lettrist that I met, but I'll leave him for a moment. So, Kathleen Goldstein was somebody else who, you saw the kind of chaos in Isou's apartment before the archive was cataloged, and at the Pompidou. I met Charlotte Vollmann, Michel Bernstein, Debord's first partner, Ginette Dufresne as well. And they were all really wonderful in terms of offering insights and access, right, to that moment. So Lemaitre, if I understand your correction, like what was the relation with Lemaitre? So I met Lemaitre once, and then we had a correspondence for a while. He would send me a lot of his publications. So I have like a stack of envelopes, which he would reuse envelopes. So the envelopes are almost like little works of art themselves. So he sent me lots of his publications prior to his passing, quite religiously. And so I have those publications and I have those envelopes with his handwriting. At some point, this doesn't have to do with off-screen cinema, but at some point he asked me to send him action films on DVD with English subtitles. So I was like, well, I don't know what type of action film Maurice Lemaitre is going to like. So I think I sent him James Bond. you know. And then, so that was something. And then Lemaitre was also somebody who loved to, you know, he had this like artistic polemic. I forget the exact name of the series, but, you know, he would send like insults and to everybody, to the, you know, the director of MoMA, the curator at MoMA, Pompidou, you know, always criticizing something. I never received an insult from Lemaitre. So maybe the lack of an insult might be some gesture to how he received my book, because he did receive the book. But so I have that exchange with him prior to his passing away. He also got very upset once that I sent him a secondhand DVD and not a new DVD. I remember that as well. So then I realized that I couldn't send secondhand DVDs, even though I was a grad student, right? And was like on a budget. So I would only send new DVDs of action films with English subtitles. So that's the first thing, I think. And then I think the second question is about P. Adam Sidney. So P. Adam Sidney, I met at Princeton. He was in the visual arts department teaching, and I was in art history as a grad student. And I had begun, as you stated in your introduction, I began grad school at Yale, and then I transferred to Princeton. And Noah Steinmatsky at Yale told me, if you go to Princeton, you have to meet P. Adam Sidney. So I went and I introduced myself to P. Adam Sidney, and then I was his teaching assistant for his post-war cinema class. So I actually taught with him a class that dealt with, you know, American film and avant-garde film, European and American primarily. And then I don't know if I think probably when I learned about Lettrist film, I asked him about it. And so then he became my primary interlocutor at that point in terms of how Lettrist film circulated in the American context, in the American underground cinema context. And, you know, I'm not a film scholar by training. So I'm by training an art historian. And so I remember this phrase once that P. Adams used. He said that I loaned myself to film studies to write the Lettrist cinema book. So I was like on loan, which I think is great, because I don't feel that I'm necessarily a film scholar, but I do think that as an art historian, and there are certain methodologies that I could bring to Lettrist film that might not be part of, let's say, a classical, you know, film studies department, which might focus more on film qua film, or image qua image in a film and narrative, and not necessarily to those external components, which I think to me are so constitutive of Lettrist cinema and what makes it so interesting. So when I had finished the manuscript, I asked P. Adams if he would read it. He very graciously read it. I mean, he made in times line edits. It was above and beyond any feedback that I would have anticipated, very generous. And so that was great. And even last year, he sent me, he's currently at work transcribing and editing some recently found transcripts of lectures by Ken Kelman, a film critic. And so P. Adams sent me an unpublished document of Ken Kelman on Isou's Traité de Bavie d'Éternité. So it's quite interesting, you know, in addition to those Brackage letters that I was able to track down. P. Adam Sidney was also a crucial mediator in helping me be in contact with Brackage's widow as well, to get permission to reproduce those as part of the annex, because I think that, you know, as a primary document, I think it's good for those to be out in the world, even though I don't necessarily deal with Brackage, right, per se, in the book. So that's all of that. And then Universidade de Verão was something else, was like the most beautiful pedagogical teaching experience I think I've ever had. It was quite magical. So the Universidade de Verão, that was in January 2012, and Danielle Stigman Mangrané was the organizer in collaboration with Capacete. Danielle lives in Rio. And I had met Danielle, I guess, in 2007 for the first time. And he invited me to participate. And at that moment, I was writing the book. And so I decided, rather than show to a Brazilian public my very initial research on Brazil, I was like, well, I'm kind of almost done with Lettrism, and let me do that. And so most of the students from various parts of Brazil had never heard of Lettrism, but that's not astonishing. So, I mean, not many people had in 2012, really. And so we had a very small balloon. It wasn't a very big balloon, right? And we put it there in this, from the images, it seems very precarious, but it was quite charming and had its own kind of poetics. Created a shadow. I mean, the original balloon was 2 meters wide. So, you can't find that size of a weather balloon and install it without having some real assistance with that. And the students enjoyed it. And I did the workshop for 2 days. So I don't remember what I showed. I think I showed Lemaitre's film, and then we did the reconstruction of the concept. And not only did I talk about film, but I also talked about differences between Lettrist poetry and Volman's pneumatic poetry. And we would go through what the differences it means to have a kind of inflection or intonation in one's speech versus pneumatic poetry for Volman, which was really about a kind of air current or breath that would be modulated prior to arriving at the organs of speech. So we went through all these kind of different kind of breathing somatic exercises as well. And what I remember about the anti-concept was that the students were so kind of taken by this that every time they would be in the city and they would see a white sphere, they would take a photograph of it and send it to me. So I have this collection of these like white spheres in and around Rio as these potential surfaces of projection, but also these wonderful markers of how, this, almost kind of fugitive film production of the early 1950s can still impact today, right? And artists, because the students at the Universidade de Verão were mostly artists. And so how those films kind of impact perception and kind of open perception in a different way was really lovely and a very singular experience at that time to show those films in that context. So.
Obrigado, Kaira. Que experiência. Quantas experiências, né? O Cinema Letrista.
Fábio, acho que você se mutou sem querer no meio da fala.
Ops, desculpa. Desde do Maurice Lemaitre, te enviando os materiais, os filmes, com legendas em inglês, né, até a recolocação, a remontagem do Gil Volman. Né? Eu queria te fazer uma segunda questão, mas que tem a ver com a pesquisa de arquivos. Né? Você fez uma ampla pesquisa de arquivos e a sua fala, né, o material que você nos trouxe em termos de imagens, né, ele demonstra isso. Né? Eu creio que você, enfim, fez uma grande viagem, uma grande volta, e eu queria que você falasse um pouco dos materiais de arquivo. Que tipos de materiais você encontrou, né? Enfim, as características desses materiais e se você levou tudo em conta ou deixou algo de fora. Enfim, como que foi isso?
Thank you, Fabio. So archives, I love archives, I should say, and I love archival research, even though as somebody who loves archival research, I get sometimes too wedded to the documents. And so, I think of the archive ultimately in two ways, the actual physical archive, right? But then the archive, what has been said about a particular movement. And so in the case of the Lettrist, there was the actual archive, which I, visited at the Beinecke in Paris, went to various places. But then the fact that the archive of what had been said about Lettrism was mostly written by the Lettrists themselves, right? And so how does one say something about Lettrist work that they have not already said about their work? Because they were also historicizing their work at the same time that they were producing work. It was very endogamic in terms of its production. And so that was also one of the challenges. How do I say something? I want to say something that hasn't already been said. And so I made a really radical cut. I mean, I talk about 5 films in 2 years, right? 1951 to 1952. This is like hyper focused. And I think just focusing on that and not really worrying about like what lettrism was in the 1970s, not going to worry about nutritional therapies at this point. I'm focusing on film in the immediate war moment, right? And then that allowed me to also move to adjacent terrains, but also understand, what are the conditions of cinema that are emerging in the post-war moment, in a moment after World War II, after German occupation, before cinema and even, auteur films from France, even before the New Wave becomes the New Wave, right? Which is, what most people know in terms of post-war French cinema, like what is going on at that moment. And so by focusing on that, I think it allowed for a lot of specificity in terms of what the films are doing, but also looking closely at the materials of the film would direct me to what kind of adjacent history I would need to move to. So the fact that, I'll limit myself to, two films. So for Traité de Bavie et d'Éternité, the fact that the found footage comes from the Armed Forces Ministry. And then you think about the fact that, there's not television in every household. I mean, television in France is like something of the 1960s, really. It's not of the 1950s. And people are, in addition to reading newspapers or magazines, they're going to the movies and they're seeing actualité, newsreels before the feature film. And so when I would go to the Gaumont Pathé archives, I'd be like, okay, well, how was the war in Indochina being reported, right? And then you begin to see that many of the shots in those films that were used for filmed news are not so different than what Isou had appropriated and used, right? And so then this becomes, another resonance in terms of what the dominant visibility of those type of shots were at that time in France for a film going public. And then in the case of Wollmann, why a weather balloon? Like, what a strange thing to use a weather balloon as a screen, right? I mean, this is quite fascinating. This is my favorite film of all the films, I have to say. I mean, just like, I love L'Anticoncept. I love that there's no image. I love that it's just black and white. I love that, it takes you on this like verbal journey that ends up with screams at the end. But the fact that it was a weather balloon, then I have to ask myself, okay, it's a weather balloon. And to my knowledge, there was no rationale provided by Wollmann as to why a weather balloon. And so then I go into this deep dive of what's the history of weather balloons? And then you realize that they're used, or I realized that they were used in war for, kind of vision at a distance, surveillance, and all these other things. So the actual support is a militarized technique that had been used in war as well. And so it gives it, another realm of valence. But I do think that, having this initial very extreme cut of just, let's say it's like 5 years total, but the 5 films being produced in 2 years. And I'm trying to think of other. So even though I make this cut, I think it's always important. And this is just more of a method thing, is like to be important, to be open to the contingencies of research. So I remember I was at the BNF, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and I happened upon, I don't know how, the article by Bazin about how to lead the film club debate. And this was in the actual newspaper or microfilm in which it was published. I don't remember where it was published right now, but in any case, and then I was like, oh, that's so interesting. He's codifying a kind of pedagogical frame for how one needs to discuss film. And I had already started the research on the Lettrist. And so it became, that became another element in terms of how to think about how the Lettrists were resuscitating the film club and how Bazin was wanting to codify a certain way of relating to the visual image that would restrict discussion to before and after, right? And so this is, let's say this is a moment of the invention of silence in cinema. Not that cinemas are silent anymore, but they're, if you go to a filmothèque or a cinemathèque now, that is still the kind of reigning convention. So I think that's part of the archival response.
Obrigado, Kaira. A gente tem uma questão aqui, enfim, colocada pelo chat, via chat, a gente pode ler aqui dentro, ela está em inglês, né? Você pode ler junto aqui comigo, do Rodrigo Faustini. There is any record on what initially drew Isou from poetry to cinema? I guess the publication of Lot was a turning point, and maybe the film clubs. Also, Kaira, there is someone on the chat asking for your email in order to ask further questions. Is that?
Tá mutada.
Yes.
Obrigada, Murilo. Meu e-mail está no site da Universidade da Flórida, você pode achar lá. E eu respondo. Pode ser que eu vou demorar, mas my email's on my UF webpage. You just have to put my name in Google. It's very... Okay, so I'm going to read Rodrigo's... I'm just kind of tapping into how this is coming. So Murilo, you put in Rodrigo's record about what initially drew Isou from poetry to cinema. That's a good question. I would probably ask my fellow traveler, Frederic Aquaviva, what motivated that shift. Although, you know, it's not just poetry to cinema. It's initially like poetry to music, and then on, right? So poetry, music, maybe cinema's next, but then there's a treatise on theater, and that continues. And somewhere in that, around 1949, he also writes, you know, the book Le Mécanique des Femmes about female sexuality, for which he ends up in jail. And then the publication of Yon was a turning point. Well, Yon does not have it has his treatise, Esthétique du Cinéma. It doesn't have the film script to traiter. If I don't have it here with me, otherwise I would look at it. Yon was published in 1952. Mark O published it, right? I think I have to like kind of go back into my own archive in my mind to remember what year it was published. It's certainly a turning point in terms of bringing together all of that material and thoughts on Lettrist film production, and his treatise Esthétique du Cinéma, perhaps the most cogent explanation of his theories for cinema at that time. We also have an early script for Debord's Hurlements en faveur de Sade that is there as well, which ends up changing later. And then the film clubs. If the film clubs drew Isou to cinema, I mean, they're a venue, right? But you also had places where live poetry was performed in those years in Paris. So, you know, poetry wasn't just about being, you know, read, it was about being spoken at that time, and there were venues for that. So I think that those, you know, the film club ends up being perhaps somewhat comparable to those spaces in which live poetry was also performed in those years. So hopefully I answered Rodrigo's question more or less.
Cara, eu gostaria de continuar com algumas questões, né? Uma delas você já adiantou na sua fala, era a relação do Isou com Stan Brakhage, né? E por meio daquelas cartas, da correspondência que você encontrou, né? Então, o Screen Cinema, ele apresenta um interessante anexo, né? Com a reprodução das cartas, da reprodução da correspondência trocada entre o Isou e o Stan Brakhage no início dos anos 60, né? E eu acho que era um momento em que, né, os dois já tinham uma arte consolidada, Isou e Brakhage, de algum modo, né? Enfim, traços consolidados, né? Enfim, fala um pouco mais para a gente dessas cartas, essa possível relação.
Yeah, I think that I think formally maybe there's a relation. I wonder if Brakhage reading Isou and Isou responding to Brakhage isn't in some sense a kind of exercise in mistranslation. I think Pierre Sidney could probably speak more to how Brakhage would have received Isou, but from what I remember and understand of Brakhage, his emphasis on the visuality of cinema and his maintenance of silence in cinema is very different than Isou's project, even though they both write on celluloid, right? I mean, I think the intervention on the celluloid is what joins them, but then there are lots of divergences as well, which I think is interesting to point out how these, two figures in two different contexts kind of come together in one way and are mutually responsive potentially to one another's work, but then kind of actually very much diverge in terms of how cinema is practiced.
Obrigado, Kaira. Vamos continuando então com o diálogo. Aqui eu teria mais uma questão para você sobre a questão do cinzelamento. Você trouxe e trabalhou ao longo da sua fala de modo bastante rico, né? O cinzelamento, o ataque direto à película, a ideia de um cinema sem imagens, né? Mas eu pergunto sobre as possibilidades e paralelos do cinzelamento com a arte do período, dado que você é, enfim, especialista, né, em história da arte do período, contemporânea e moderna. Enfim, existem possíveis paralelos, enfim, em outras artes? Como você pensa essa questão?
Thanks. That's a great question and provocation. So I can try and go by decades. So if we're thinking immediate post-war France, art informel, abstract expressionism, I would say, given how the field of painting in the post-war moment is regulated in many instances by the absence of language, right? So abstract expressionism is something in which the visual representation of verbal language doesn't happen, and does not really happen if you think of like Jean Fautrier, and you have mostly painters dedicated to abstraction in the post-war moment. So there's a way in which Isou's lettrism, because it's like, how the poem goes into music and music is cinema, or no, the novel is cinema, right? And there's always this way in which one medium expands and displaces the conventions of another, that is very much a kind of heterodox modernism at that time, compared to what's going on around it, I would say. I have always been left with a kind of curiosity about that moment in terms of this is going to sound very strange, but at some point in my research, I did do this deep dive into quantum physics and was interested in paradigm shifts about, like Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and principles of indeterminacy. And so you have Isou in his Esthétique du Cinéma at times making reference to like particles, right? And so this is interesting. Why is he talking about particles and subatomic particles? And then Georges Mathieu, like on the other side of the spectrum in terms of painting, also refers to physics and quantum physics in terms of indeterminacy in painting. And so you have two artists who are very different, right? Isou and Georges Mathieu are like on different sides of the spectrum, both in terms of the visuality of what they produce, but also politically, right? And in terms of, where they circulate. But I wonder if there isn't something to be said about the reception of certain scientific paradigms at that time in the 1950s that inform Isou's chiseling, right? And inform other types of painterly process that can't be thought necessarily through the line of chiseling, but can be thought in a different way through this kind of larger question of paradigm shifts within science. In terms of art history, I mean, I think towards the end, I gestured a bit in terms of how, if we think of Isou as a type of institutional critique of cinema, then we have a different origin for thinking the, institutional critique, I always like to say that, it's something that happens in the US and the United States, as I think about it, because oftentimes, working in Latin America and in precarious contexts, I'm like, well, maybe in Venezuela, they're just hoping the institutions function. So like institutional critique is a different thing, right? And so for a specific genealogy of institutional critique, I think that the Lettrist's critique of cinema and mobilization of how to practice cinema in a different way is interesting for thinking about how we can mobilize and think about museums functioning in a different way, or the legacy of institutional critique in the figure of somebody like Marcel Brotars. In terms of my own work on Nouveau Réalisme, I think that the Lettrists very much informed the work of Raymond Hans and Jacques Villègle, and Hannah Feldman has written really wonderfully and persuasively about that. I mean, you go from, spoken poetry to the visually tattered letters on torn posters that Dufresne, Villègle, and Raymond Hans all produced at the time. So I think that they're important, more from the visual arts perspective, I guess, in terms of thinking the visual arts within art history. Trying to think, was there another prompt in that in relation to art history?
Você vê alguma relação, é uma questão nova. O letrismo tem relação com, heranças do surrealismo, e, por exemplo, o Grupo Cobra. Enfim, houve algum contato, alguma relação, ou é muito longe entre, os letristas e o Grupo Cobra?
If there was, I think it would be probably through Asger Jorn, right? But it's been a while that I haven't been mergulhada nessa história, but I wouldn't be surprised, but I can't answer that with certainty right now.
Tá bom, uma provocação. Foi uma provocação. Kaira, a gente poderia avançar um pouco para os seus outros trabalhos. Eu sei que você tem avançado com outros trabalhos, relacionando arte, psiquiatria, arte e loucura. A gente poderia partir do próprio letrismo, né? Existe a história do Isidore Isou, que teria sido internado, foi em 1968, se não me engano. Enfim, você tem mais, dados sobre essa passagem da vida do Isidore Isou?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is interesting, this is going to go back to your previous question or your penultimate question and then come back forward again in terms of thinking about Lettrism's place within art history. I think one of the things is that there are these tireless researchers, right? So Isou researched everything: history of poetry, history of cinema, mathematics, the economy, psychiatry. And that kind of, I don't know if to call it transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary practice, I think in some ways prefigures, I don't know how much this is discussed in Brazil, but, there's a lot of discussion in the US and in Europe about what is artistic research or the artist as researcher paradigm. And so I think that there's something there to think about in terms of contemporary practices and how they were such, Isou was such a researcher at the end of the day and felt he was contributing to these different fields of knowledge. And so within that, he ultimately moves to the history of psychiatry after his internment. He's interned at Sainte-Anne after having a nervous breakdown. And he produces a illustrated novel, Jonas, of his experience. And, my third book was about art and mental health out in the Brazilian context. And then I began to think about, okay, so Isou suffered a mental health crisis and Lygia Clark was living in Paris at the same time. And so you have these two figures that in my intellectual universe are fine, but people who look at me think that's like totally strange, right? You have Lygia Clark and Isidore Isou, and how do you put those two people together, right? And so then you put them together, and then you realize that Lygia Clark is impacted by the anti-psychiatric movement and the protests against psychiatry in France. She's going to the cinema. She's seeing films about experimental psychological processes. She's going to psychoanalysis as well. She's teaching and doing things related to the body. And then you have Isou with his critique, on the other hand, violently critiquing and inserting himself within a genealogy of artists, right, including Artaud, as having been mistreated by psychiatry. And Lygia Clark, she produces her camisa de forza, the one that's made with this net, her straitjacket, in Paris as well. So you have these literal, almost, it's not an iconographic work, but she's literally dealing with the iconography of psychiatric confinement. So now I forgot where your question was, but anyway, so I brought these two situations together in Immanent Vitalities, and it was an essay that I originally wrote for an exhibition at Reina Sofia, and it just gets one thinking. On the one hand, it was a double move, right? It was, how do we get lettrism out of lettrism, because they end up only being compared to themselves, even though they, you mentioned surrealism, and you can repeat for me what you said about surrealism. And then Lygia Clark is often framed as if she's the only artist who moves into therapeutic proposals. And Isou developed an entire like psychocladology, like therapeutic proposal about taking into account the entirety of the person. And so that it's curious. And so it just, so in a way, doing the research on art and mental health in Brazil allowed me to return to lettrism in a way that I had not originally approached it, which was more about this question in the 60s and questions of psychiatry, May 68, the protests about, the dominant social and political order, of which protests against psychiatry were also a part. So you said something about surrealism. I said, não me lembro mais o que você falou do surrealismo.
Não precisa, está respondido.
Okay.
Você respondeu além, obrigado. Kaira, eu só estava pensando no seu trajeto de pesquisa, enfim, do letrismo para, enfim, as relações entre arte e loucura no Brasil. Existe isso também no cinema, é possível, né, pensar alguns filmes que trabalham também com isso, mas eu vi que você acaba de lançar, né, um livro sobre o Lula Vanderlei, né, no silêncio que as palavras guardam, né? Será que você poderia, enfim, falar um pouco? Enfim, a gente já está modificando de tema, mas é que eu acho que faz parte do seu trajeto.
Yeah, I will say that the figure that unites my thinking is Antonin Artaud. I think that is important, because Artaud, if one goes to Spectres of Artaud, the exhibition, you have lettrism, you have Lygia Clark, you have John Cage, and you have it divided into a critical and a clinical frame. And so there already is a kind of certain continuity that this was not conscious on my part, because that's not, this is like, oh yeah, retroactively, of course it makes sense. Isou and Lygia Clark were at the end of Spectres of Artaud together, but I only kind of began to think that like 5 years later, even though I had put them in exhibition with Frédéric in, basically one gallery next to the other. Cinema and mental health. Yes, I absolutely think that there is a way to think about cinema and mental health. On the one hand, you have a series of documentary films about that subject, right? Films even about Laborde, which is, a non-traditional clinic that was devoted to institutional psychotherapy outside of Paris in the Loire Valley where Guattari worked. And so I think that there's that. And then there are artists, somebody like Javier Telles, who works with present-day usuários da psiquiatria to produce films. Lula Vanderlei also does films with the usuários da psiquiatria. And of course, in the history of film, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a great film for the kind of reversibility of, who is the psychiatrist and who is crazy. And that becomes all mixed in this early German expressionist film. So yes, and I know that Tom Mitchell, who is a scholar at the University of Chicago, he was going to be writing a book about cinema and madness. I think it's a little different than thinking about mental health in the context of the ongoing struggles for psychiatric reform. But yes, I do think that there is a long history in different ways in which the cinema kind of intervenes in that context. Yes, and o filme do Leon Hirschman também, alguém botou.
Imagens do Inconsciente, eu coloquei aqui.
Sim.
Lembrei no meio da sua fala, do Imagens do Inconsciente. Mas é isso, Kaira. Será que tem mais alguma questão, enfim, no chat de fora? Não sei, vamos esperar. Se não houver nenhuma questão...
I have one thing I want to say.
Yes.
If there's no question, is that there's this great quote from Isou's Traité de ma vie d'éternité, which it's in the soundtrack, in which Isou says, "I love the cinema when it is insolent and it does what it is not supposed to do." So I think this is a great inspiration as an art historian to do what art history is not supposed to do.
Ótimo, Kaira. Tirar as pessoas da própria cadeira. Foi de onde você partiu, enfim, a sua fala até, enfim, a partir das pessoas sentadas assistindo ao fim da exposição. O Gil Volman, né? Enfim, devemos conversar ou não no cinema. Eu acho que talvez depois da pandemia devamos, enfim, levar em conta mais as experiências letristas, né? Enfim, e ter um outro tipo de espectatorialidade, né? Eu acho que o letrismo, nesse caso, ele é uma outra questão. Enfim, a gente tem questões intermináveis aqui, mas eu acho que você propõe também essa ideia de que o letrismo ele permite pensar numa outra genealogia da história da arte, por exemplo, né? Enfim, uma outra genealogia que seria pautada não na imagem, mas e sim, né, no speech, enfim, nas falas, né? Enfim, eu acho isso muito interessante.
Yeah, it's a very curious proposal. Like, what does it mean to make a cinema for the ear?
Certo. Gente, então a gente vai encerrar. Estava tão ótima a conversa. Obrigado, Kaira. Então, se não há mais questões, enfim, ou questões intermináveis, uma conversa para outras vezes, numa próxima vez sobre cinema e psiquiatria. Obrigado, Kaira, né, pelo conhecimento em torno do cinema do Isidore do letrismo, por todo o material que você trouxe aqui para a gente, um riquíssimo material, né, e de pesquisa, que eu acho que dá para circular aqui também agora, né? E, enfim, agradecemos em nome do primeiro simpósio de Cinema Internacional, de Cinema e Análise Fílmica, e se você houver mais alguma coisa para falar, enfim, deixo os agradecimentos também em nome de toda a equipe, em nome, né, de todos que participam da realização desse evento. Obrigado, Kaira.
Obrigada a vocês. Eu sempre adoro falar no Brasil, mesmo não estando no Brasil. Então, realmente eu me sinto sempre bem acolhida no Brasil. Então, é um prazer, realmente. Obrigada pelo convite.
Nós que agradecemos. Obrigado, Kaira. Vou pegar aqui.